I didn't ruin my life all at once. I ruined it slowly by staying. I learned the sound a door makes when it's kept closed for years, the soft, stubborn rasp of expectations pressing against the frame. I learned it the first winter I kept to a chair in a coffee shop at the edge of town, where the rain sounded like a tired engine outside and a woman named Mara told me to take a risk I could barely bear to hear. I was 36 then, or maybe 38. The numbers blur the way a streetlight blurs when you drive through a fog you pretend isn't there. I had a job I believed in, one that wore the color of responsibility like a badge. Steady revenue, a name you could show to a parent, a future you could outline on a whiteboard in neat, punctuated strokes. The office smelled of lemon cleaner and old wood, as if someone had decided to repaint an honest place. The walls wore the accumulation of years, the certificates, the faded photos, the little desk figurines that watched you with the patience of librarians. I believed in the project we had built, the thing that would outlive me if I stayed long enough, the thing that would prove I wasn't merely drifting. We spoke in measured tones about risk, about stakeholders and timelines, about the discipline of not making promises you couldn't keep. In the mornings, I stood at the same kitchen window and watched the street awaken with its own insistence. The bus that coughed to life, the dog that marked a corner with a careful, loyal howl. The days passed with the friction of routine, the comfort of the same mug warmed by the same kettle, the same colleagues who knew how to smile without meaning to, who knew how to ask for a report and still borrow your lunch if you forgot to pack one. Staying felt like maturity wearing heavy shoes. It felt like leverage, like the simplest arithmetic. Invest a few more years, secure a little more stability, avoid the weather of risk that blows through a life you aren't ready to scatter. There were mornings when the coffee tasted like a promise I could still believe in, and afternoons when the fluorescent lights hummed and reminded me that the world's concerns were not mine to solve, only to manage. I kept the parts of myself that mattered for the job. My notes, my careful manner, the jokes that landed just enough to be safe but never brave. In meetings, I learned to listen as if listening were a kind of duty, to repeat back what was said with an exactness that could be mistaken for wisdom. The work grew into a shelter, the shelter grew into a cage, and I mistook the twice daily weather inside for weather inside me. Sometimes I allowed a small ceremony of change to happen in the spaces between tasks. A longer lunch, a walk that circled the block rather than cutting through it, the habit of standing by the window after someone else left the morning meeting and thinking how easily a life can shrink to a routine you call character. I tell myself I was building something durable, something you could hand to your son or daughter, something that would not crack under the tremors of a market or a relapse of hope. The phrasing felt noble, even when the truth felt dull. My reasons kinder than the actual consequence of staying. Loyalty turned into a currency I spent only on myself, a savings account of sameness that paid out nothing but the quiet ache of time misused. I watched relationships soften and soften again, as if they were a line of rope being pulled ever tighter. The colleague who married late and then toppled into quiet, the friend who moved away and never called, the person I met on a rare weekend when the city showed us two suns for a day and we pretended to be brave together. We spoke in soft, careful tones about changes we wouldn't make because changes required letting go of the map we already had. The conversations never turned into storms. They turned into recipes for staying the same with the brave words of people who wanted to believe in the future. We called it dedication, and sometimes I believed it because belief is a heavy thing when you've counted the cost and found it acceptable. There were nights when I tuned out the clock and listened to the city breathe instead. The distant freight trains, the siren's distant lullaby, the way the river returned to its own dark pulse, as if it were a memory of something you once loved and forgot to protect. My apartment grew with the years as if it, too, were part of a plan to prove I could endure without breaking. The furniture wore a respectful patina. The walls gathered the quiet prayers of a man who told himself he was prudent, that he understood the world's volatility and asked only to endure it from the inside. On weekends, I would wash bread-drying towels in a kitchen that already knew my fingerprints and the shape of my doubts, and I would remind myself that I was a citizen of a small, trustworthy town, that I had secured a life that would not abandon me in a storm. The hook of a life well-constructed felt almost like a whisper you mistake for wind. I wasn't ruined by a single disastrous choice. I was mellowed, softened, shaped by the gentle insistence of staying. The cost appeared not as a ruin but as a gradual tinting of what I could see and what I could imagine. The world grew a certain distance, not a chasm, and I learned to measure it with a ruler that never seemed to reach. I missed chances not because I failed to see them, but because I saw them and chose to see through them. People moved on. Marriages, friendships, even the neighborhood's old stores changed their names and faces, and I remained, the same quiet wall anchoring myself to a life I could count on to keep me intact. The moment of awareness didn't crash in with thunder. It came as a soft, almost forgetful collision. A sentence someone said in the corridor after a late meeting, a habit of a younger colleague who decided to gamble on a different path, a reflection in a glass that showed me the same man with the same clothes but a different kind of wear on the edges. He looked back at me with a tired honesty I hadn't wanted to own. I heard myself in the language of the words we choose when we are tired of pretending to be fine. I'm not asking you to pity me. I only want you to understand. It wasn't a demand for rescue or redemption, just a realization that I had become the person who never left. The phrase hovered in my head for days, not as a shout but as a memory, as if someone from my own past had pressed a quiet, merciful hand to my shoulder and asked quietly what I planned to do now. My reflections drifted toward the universal truth that comfort, when worn like armor, can be more dangerous than anything that fails. Staying felt like strength, a refusal to test your own edges, a stubborn mutual assurance that the way things are is a proof of what you are capable of enduring. And yet the longer I looked at that truth, the more it sounded like fear dressed in respectable clothes. Time doesn't warn you. It doesn't sermonize or scold. It slips past you with the precision of a patient librarian, shelving your possibilities with the same care you reserved for your responsibilities. The minutes don't scream. They accumulate, and you wake up one morning to find your life is a room you know by memory but have not fully lived in for a long time. I don't pretend to offer an anthem or a path, only a listening. If you hear something here, perhaps it's because you've stood still long enough to notice the difference between what you built to protect yourself and what you might have become if you had chosen differently, even when the choice felt like a betrayal of something you believed in. The truth was not a crisis but a cadence, a rhythm that started as a murmur and grew into something you could hold in your hands, fragile, ordinary, undeniable. The sense that I had traded the raw, uncertain courage of change for a reassuring, predictable calm, and in that exchange, I had become the quietest version of myself, the one who forgives the past by not letting it go. The broader insight arrived not in a moment of revelation but in the slow widening of the room I called my life. Comfort can be a battlefield in disguise. It's easier to fight for the known than for the unknown, easier to protect a routine than to chase what trembles at the edge of possibility. Staying can feel like love, lovely, stable, responsible, but love that refuses to move can turn into a gravity we cannot escape. The years teach you to measure risk with a single lens. What you can keep, what you can confirm, what you cannot bear to lose. And what you lose, you realize, is not always a thing but the chance to become more than a version of yourself you've already outgrown. To you who listen, I say this with the gentleness of someone who has learned to speak with restraint. You are not a failure for choosing the safer path when the road grew too uncertain to name. You are not a fool for wanting to stay healthy, for wanting to feel the ground beneath your feet stay solid when the storm of change seems to arrive without invitation. But you are the one who carries the quiet, unspoken cost of every door you left closed. Every door you opened and found it led to the same room with a different window. The caution that once kept you from falling may also have kept you from flying. I am older now, enough to know the price of staying without pretense. The days are thinner, the nights longer, and the city's old ache remains, a patient, watchful thing that knows when you want to pretend again. Sometimes I catch sight of a younger version of myself in a storefront window, a man who could be hopeful because he did not yet understand the weight of commitments. I am careful not to sentimentalize him. He would have fallen just as hard for the safe harbor, just as surely misread the power of a single braver choice. The difference is that I recognize the fault line now, and I have learned, in the quietest way, to listen for it before it becomes a crack you cannot repair with the language of maturity. There is no dramatic outcry here, no thunderclap of repentance. Just a line in the mirror, just a morning where the coffee tastes like a man who still believes in something, and yet the room around him has learned to argue with his beliefs with the kind of patient, inexorable quiet that time makes when you're not looking. The truth I live with isn't the truth I preached. It is the truth of how a life can be measured in the length of its stay rather than the breadth of its leaps, how the shallow breathing of routine can steady you while it also suffocates the part of you that longed for risk, for chance, for a different end to the same story. And so I remain, not as a saint of the ordinary, but as a witness to a cost most do not notice until the tally is tallied in the quiet after lights are out. If you listen, you will hear the small sounds of a life that refused to abandon the known for the unknown. And you will hear, too, the softer, heavier sound of a life that finally chooses to acknowledge what it has become because it can no longer bear the other possibility. Not triumph, not confession, just the honest arithmetic of a heart that learned too late that staying can be a kind of waiting, until the waiting becomes the whole of you. I walk through the city as if I'm walking through a memory of myself, the old version trailing behind me like a coat sleeve that still bears the scent of rain and coffee and careful plans. I pause to listen to a street musician, to the hush between breaths of strangers on a bus, to the way a child's laughter travels and then folds back into the quiet of a doorway. These sounds don't promise a different end. They remind me that life continues to insist on its own form, whether or not you choose to be part of its shaping. Some days I think about the door I kept closed for so long, the door that led to a life I believed I could trust. The door is still there, not broken, just heavy with the memory of every hour I chose not to step through. I do not pretend to be relieved by this memory, nor do I pretend that it's over. It is simply a line drawn in a notebook I kept out of stubbornness, a line that marks the border between the life I had and the life I might have lost the courage to claim. In the end, you might call me a cautionary tale or you might call me a patient one. I am neither. I am a man who stayed, and in staying learned that staying is a choice with a price paid not in storms but in the soft, unrelenting weather of a life that grew quiet around him. If you listen long enough, you'll hear a truth not spoken aloud. The most honest harm is the harm you pretend not to see. And so I close this memory with a line that sounds almost like weather. The horizon remains stubbornly there, not as a promise but as a rumor you carry in your pocket, unspent. I walk toward it with a certain reluctant grace, not because I deserve a different ending, but because endings, whether chosen or granted, are still beginnings of another shape of life I have yet to learn to live. The room I inhabit accepts me, the walls know my name, and the city, in its quiet insistence, keeps time for the man who stayed too long. If you hear yourself in this, listen not for advice but for resonance. The ache that says you might have stayed when you could have moved, the ache that says you might move now and still be followed by the same quiet it leaves behind. The truth is not a blueprint. It is a quiet ledger that only you can read after the lights go down, when the room has learned to listen as you do, and the morning comes with the same patient, unspectacular arrival as the first day you chose to stay. The cost is merely this: a life where the edges blur, where the brave thing you might have done lingers in the periphery, and where the mirror you finally meet shows you not the man you hope to become, but the man you have learned to be, by staying long enough to see what never leaves, and what, in time, simply cannot be rescued from the room you chose to inhabit.